Driving a new car, or even one made 20 years ago, is pretty easy really. But what's it like to drive a car made 40, 60, or even 80 years ago? Well, to find out, I headed to Vauxhall's 2017 Griffin Greats Event. Run every year, this event brings together a selection of cars from Vauxhall's heritage fleet. They span nearly every decade of the company's history, going back more than 100 years. So, it seems like there's no better place to find out just what old cars are like to drive. And this is where we're going to start. This is a Vauxhall HType, and it was made in 1937. This was one of the first Vauxhalls to feature a synchronised gearbox, so you don't have to double declutch every time you change gear. It's quite easy, you just slowly slide it out of one gear into the next, just like you would with a modern car. It would have made at the time an enormous difference to how people drove. It effectively halves the amount of work you have to do with your legs. It's brilliant. Lots of other things about this car are quite familiar too. So it's got an ordinary H-pattern gear lever, albeit with a dog leg first, so it's to your left and down instead of to your left and up. It also had independent front suspension, and that meant it could deal with bumps far better than conventional cars at the time. If you peer out over the incredibly thin bonnet, you can almost see both headlights. And combine that with these two very narrow seats, which in the back, they have armrests, they're just like armchairs. And it really feels like you're driving along in an incredibly narrow car on a very big road. On a country lane like this, it's absolutely fantastic. You can poodle along, doing all of maybe 20 or 30 miles an hour in third gear without a care in the world. But as soon as you head out onto a faster B road, or heaven forbid a dual carriageway, you will feel completely swamped by traffic. It really doesn't like going quickly. There are no indicators, instead it's got trafficators. So little levers pop out of the door pillars when you want to change lanes, and the little switch down here controls them. The steering is incredibly vague, and it only gets worse the faster you go. So you can sort of turn the wheel a good 30 degrees before anything actually happens. It's slightly disconcerting, especially when you're going, what for this car is quite quickly. This is a 1953 Vauxhall EType Wyvern. It's one of the first cars they produced after the Second World War, and it's actually based on a Chevrolet underneath, because Vauxhall had been bought by General Motors a few decades earlier. So you jump in this thing, and the first thing you notice is the unbelievably squidgy bench seat down here, and a huge column shift, which is slightly tricky to use. Visibility is fantastic. Everywhere you look, there are these huge glass panes, and the pillars are ever so thin. It doesn't feel like it'd offer much protection in a crash, but back then, in the 50s, people weren't concerned about that. It's got a 4-cylinder, 35 brake horsepower engine, which would eventually get you to 70 miles an hour, although it would take the best part of half a minute to get to 60. The clutch biting point is right at the top of the pedal travel, so every time you pull away, you're just thinking, oh, is there any clutch left? But there always is. It's not the most comfortable car ever. It's incredibly boaty, so it wallows and it bucks over these rutted roads, something that's not really helped by the incredibly bouncy seats. And it's not just the styling or the interior or the way that it drives that date it. It's little things that you just don't get on cars these days anymore. Like the silver knob on the steering wheel boss. That's the indicators. But then there are other things that feel perfectly normal. So there's a glove box down here. There are these little cubby holes down by the doors. Back then, this was a practical family car, and it had to do practical family things. So there's loads of room in the back. The back seat is equally squidgy, and there's just as much leg and headroom back there. It really is great. So fast forward to 1959, and you get this. And this is a PA Velux. And it's styled once again to look like Chevrolets of the 50s. So it's got this wonderful wraparound windscreen up front. And the roof is quite low as well. But then it isn't an American car, so it's not quite as big as American cars of the time. So I'm a fairly tall bloke, I'm 6'2", and I'm really struggling with this enormous steering wheel here. And it's got a column shift again, but the problem with the column shift is when you try and change into third, which is away and down, it sort of hits your knee a bit. So when you're driving along, if you go to reach for the clutch, your knee's already pushing the car out of gear, which is a bit strange. It has got a terrific bench seat, just like the Wyvern. It's not quite as comfortable, but it's not bad. There's a fair amount of space in the back, and you'll feel a little bit less claustrophobic in here because it's got a wonderful white headlining. To fit in with the big, wallowy American cruiser image this car was going for, it has a 2.25 litre straight-six engine, so it's actually really smooth. You accelerate through the gears, and although the linkage is a bit floppy, it really does pull itself along quite nicely. Absolutely no complaints there. I've no idea what it would be like on a motorway, but at 50 or 60 miles an hour, it's quite happy to trundle along. It's also got this fantastic speedometer, so it's almost like a bar graph that works its way around the dial as you accelerate and decelerate. It really does feel like an American car that's been put on a bit too hot a wash and it's shrunk around you. It rides not particularly comfortably, so it does take a bit of a jolt when you go through a big bump and wallow over undulations in the road, but it's not too bad. The steering is so much better than the Wyvern. It's a little more direct, but it's nowhere near as slow, so you don't have to twirl the wheel around every time you want to go around a corner. It's so much easier. It's the 70s. What do you buy to tell the neighbours that you're not doing too badly? You want something big, you want something upmarket, and you want something with millions of acres of turquoise vinyl on the interior. So what do you get? You buy this. This is a 1975 Fe Victor. It's so big and the cabin is so square, it's almost like you're on an observation deck of an early 20th century train or a steamliner. You can see absolutely everything out of this car. And it only has 2 seats in the back, but they're so nicely upholstered and thickly bolstered that you could just settle down and you could while away miles in this car without breaking a sweat. And the car won't worry too much either. Its 2.3 litre engine will happily cruise along in any gear. There are only 4 of them. And it'll pull in fourth from 30 or 40 miles an hour. It's almost like having an automatic. Once you've worked your way up to the top of the box, you can just leave it there. Terrifically easy to drive. It's surprisingly composed on the move as well, although you do get the feeling that the reason for that is not because the suspension is particularly advanced, because it's not, but rather the car is just so heavy by the time you've gone over a bump, there isn't enough shove from the pothole or the speed bump to unsettle its absolutely enormous body. So you just cruise along quite happily, not really worrying about bumps and ruts in the road. So although driving old cars might seem daunting at first, you should really give it a go. It's an enormously rewarding and hugely satisfying experience. So next time somebody hands you the keys to their 30-year-old pride and joy, don't shy away from taking it for a test drive. You'll have a brilliant time, and it'll make you appreciate all the little things that make driving a modern car easy that little bit more.